Welcome to episode 2 of Incredible Teams, the show that explores the tales behind the world's best teams and the tactics that got them there. This is your host Liam Hurd, and today we're diving into the All Blacks team of 1987 to 1990. Before we begin, I figured it did make sense to kind of briefly explain what rugby is, especially given my US-centric audience who perhaps don't quite know rugby as well as maybe I do. So 2 teams of 15 players try to, advance the ball down the field just like in American football to score a try rather than a touchdown. Players can run with the ball, kick it, and pass the ball, but can only pass backwards, not forwards. To stop the opposition, one must tackle, and it's a very free-flowing game, much more so than American football, and some would say even more aggressive and violent. There are 8 forwards, numbered 1 through 8, and 7 backs, numbered 9 through 15 on each team, with each player given a specific number correlating to their position. For instance, number 2 is known as the hooker, and number 15 as the fullback. And one more note before we begin, rugby was strictly an amateur sport until 1995. Professionalism was not only frowned upon, but strictly enforced, and working a regular job was the absolute norm for every single player at the first couple of World Cups in 87 and 1991. So, we begin far before 1995 and 1987 in May 1870, when the first rugby match was played in Nelson, New Zealand. And kind of like the previous episode where Brazil was introduced to football by Charles Miller, who had been educated in England, rugby was also introduced by immigrants to New Zealand who had played and been educated in the UK. And the structures put in place in the 1870s and 80s largely exist to today in New Zealand regarding provincial, club, and national rugby. In 1967, the Chief Justice of New Zealand, Sir Richard Wilde, said this: "Rugby exactly suited our climate and our soil. It matched the temperament of the New Zealander and in large measure has molded our national character." Importantly, also like the Brazilian natives in the previous episode, the native Maori people took to the game. They played a significant role in establishing many facets of the All Blacks still in play today, including the name itself, the All Blacks. A team actually made up mostly of Maori players embarked on a tour of Britain, Ireland, and Australia from October of 1888 to March of 1889, playing somewhere around 90 matches and another 17 before departing in New Zealand. And this was the first side to wear black uniforms and the first to perform the haka before games. Overall, they won 64, lost 20, and drew 6, a 71% win rate, and at that rate, they were playing roughly a game every 2 days. And Ron Polinsky, in his book, Rugby and New Zealand History, said regular allowable injury replacements were nearly a century away, not to mention modern medical treatment. The success of this tour put New Zealand on the sporting map and paved the way for the famous team nicknamed the Originals to tour overseas in 1905/06. And the team name the Originals established the notion that the All Blacks were the dominant force in international rugby. In Behind the Silver Fern, written by Tony Johnson and Lynn McConnell, they say, "The legend of the All Blacks really begins with the Great Tour of 1905/06. The team that became known as the Originals left New Zealand unheralded in July of 1905, returning 7 months later to heroes' welcomes, having taken the rugby world by storm." At the conclusion of the tour, the All Blacks had played 35 matches, winning 34 and losing only 1, scoring 976 points, conceding only 59. And this team sort of set the bar for every future New Zealand team touring overseas. And a brief note here as well on the format of international matches that are played in the same fashion to today. For the sake of simplification, test matches that I've already briefly mentioned are a game between 2 senior national teams. For instance, in this Originals tour, the team played 5 test matches against England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and France, with the other 30 games being played against regional, club, or university teams. The English Test in December of 1905 was played in front of between 70 and 100,000 fans, including the future King of England, who was Prince at the time, but who would become George V. Upon return to New Zealand, the players were welcomed as heroes. Okay, time marches on, and we get through the First World War. Next big tour kind of goes out, and this team is nicknamed the Invincibles. They toured the UK, Ireland, France, and the US again, this time winning all 32 matches they played and all 4 test matches against England, Wales, Ireland, and France, scoring 838 and conceding only 116 points. So we're going to kind of skip forward now. The All Blacks continued performing on the international stage throughout the 30s, somewhat in the 40s and 50s, and especially in the 1960s, when they finished that decade with 36 test match wins, 4 losses, and 3 ties. But the 1970s saw a change in fortune. Their winning percentage in test matches dropped drastically from the 90% in the 60s to just over 60%. And Johnson and McConnell write, after the all-conquering 1960s, the 70s was a decade punctuated with defeat, controversy, and some of the lower points in New Zealand rugby. 3 series were lost, 2 to the Springboks of South Africa, and for the first time to the Lions, a team made up of English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh players. And 6 other test matches were lost against France, England, and Australia, and 3 drawn, as well as defeats in 11 non-test matches, including, most gallingly, to a New Zealand junior side, a team made up of players aged 23 and under. So, if they viewed the 70s as their lowest point, the 80s were viewed as a fresh start and an opportunity to turn around their fortunes, re-establishing their dominance. And they would, but not before sinking even lower and dividing the New Zealand public. We're jumping back briefly. 1948, South Africa's National Party introduced apartheid to widespread international and domestic outrage. From the 1970s, South African teams were mostly banned from all sporting events and competitions, including the Summer Olympics of 1976. In 1976 as well, the All Blacks toured South Africa, resulting in 31 countries boycotting the Olympics. In their view, the All Blacks tour gave implicit support to the South African government. Therefore, protest was sort of expected when the Springboks travelled to New Zealand in 1981. Prime Minister at the time, Robert Muldoon, was hesitant to veto the tour, not wanting to mix politics with sport, but admitted he could see nothing but trouble coming from this. Critics of Muldoon felt that he didn't put a stop to the tour in order to secure the votes of the rural and provincial conservative population in the election that would be held later that year. As a very general rule of thumb, rural voters were more likely to be pro-tour and, worried about more New Zealand matters rather than what's going on overseas. Polensky writes, such was the power and attraction of South African rugby. The rest of the world, and especially New Zealand, wanted it when it knew it should not. The country was truly split. The New Zealand Herald, one of the papers running out of Auckland, ran a poll that reported 42% in favour and 49% against the tour. The protests that followed between pro-tour and anti-apartheid protesters were the most violent and widespread New Zealand had ever seen. From late July until mid-September, New Zealand was in a state of unrest, with heightened security at every game and widespread civil disobedience. 2 games were cancelled and the protests grew increasingly violent. Riot squads were specially assembled to quell the crowds with beatings and arrests. I'm not going to list off a comprehensive list of each game or the achievements of the protesters, but I believe the occurrences on the day of the 3rd and final test in Auckland sort of paint a pretty, representative picture. So actually, paraphrasing from Wikipedia, a low-flying Cessna 172 dropped flower bombs and flares on the pitch, with a flower bomb even hitting a New Zealand prop forward at the time. It is said the referee advised the doctor that ran on not to use water or he'll become paste. Patches of criminal gangs such as the traditional rivals Black Power and the Mongrel Mob were also evident, Black Power being Muldoon supporters. A group of peaceful protesters dressed as clowns were beaten with batons by police, and in several towns around New Zealand, protesters stormed the local TV transmitters and shut off coverage of the game. And I guess that paints a pretty good picture of sort of the disturbance and disobedience that it kind of caused. The tour came to an end, but the divide it caused would take another 6 years to properly heal. So continuing to march forward, in March of 1985, New Zealand and Australia finally received approval from the Northern Hemisphere nations, like England, France, those sorts of nations, to begin organization of the first World Cup, scheduled for 1987. Later that year, the All Blacks were scheduled to tour South Africa. However, the Prime Minister that had been elected in 84, David Lange, implored the NZRFU not to undertake the tour. His advice was considered but largely ignored. So, a couple of points. Firstly, the union and in more general, the actual players themselves considered the Springboks to be their greatest rival and considered a game against such foe to be the pinnacle. The All Blacks had never won a tour in South Africa and were motivated to do so. Secondly, the average international rugby career would last around 10 years on the high end in those days, which gives a player an opportunity to play around 2 separate times against the Springboks, 1 tour at home, 1 tour away. And thirdly, many players and New Zealand rugby executives felt sport and politics should not be mixed and that the tour should go ahead. So it was all set to go ahead until a few days before the team was set to fly out. An interim injunction was passed by the New Zealand High Court. 2 lawyers had argued that the union was in breach of a constitutional obligation to promote, foster, and develop rugby. The governing body had no choice but to cancel the tour at the 11th hour. Now, the All Blacks were pissed. They're still amateur, they were taking time off work, not being paid, delaying their retirement to go on tour. A lot of the senior players did that. And in response, those senior members began planning for a rebel tour. So instead of going to South Africa, a hastily scheduled tour of Argentina was organized. But we marched forward again into 86. The rebel tour that those senior players began organizing the previous year came to fruition. All but 2 of the players and the coach of that 85 squad decided to join. They called themselves the Cavaliers, but South Africa and the rest of the world really kind of regarded them as the All Blacks, and they did everything they could to beat them. The players and coaches essentially snuck out of the country in groups and gathered in Sydney, Australia. The media soon caught on, and about half of the general public felt deep betrayal and outrage. A previous All Blacks captain called for the players to be banned for life. They were ultimately banned for 2. One of the players, Murray Mexted, who was a number 8 and went on to become a commentator, said it was a frustrating tour because we were encouraged by the New Zealand Rugby Union off the record, then the moment we went, we were blacklisted. Also, the players and coaches that went assumed that they would get more support from the New Zealand public than they did. In the end, it was a disappointing tour, losing the test matches 3 games to 1. And the tour was marred with below-par refereeing and a nasty incident in the second game, where South African player Burger Geldenhuys punched All Black Andy Dalton so hard he had to have his jaw wired. One of the players, Andy Hayden, says, "The Geldenhuys incident was frustrating. We were disappointed to not be able to carry out our wish to go to South Africa and play that side. The benchmark side, the best or the next best in the world for us. We made every effort to go, and when we ended up going as the Cavaliers after the court injunction, we thought we had made a major effort to get there. And then the bugger king hit Dalton from behind. The thought that went through your mind was that they didn't deserve the opportunity to play us. They were in isolation. We weren't. Later that year in June, the French played one match against New Zealand. All of the Cavaliers players weren't able to play in this game, which gave opportunities to those who wouldn't have had a chance, and that team became nicknamed the Baby Blacks because most of that squad was playing for the first time for the All Blacks. David Kirk, a halfback or number 9, captained the side for the first time, and he would go on to captain them during their World Cup run the next year. Hooker, Sean Fitzpatrick, went on to play 92 tests and still holds the record for the most consecutive test matches played with 63, and he made his debut in that game. In October of 86, the All Blacks set off on an 8-match tour of France, and this team was a mixture of the Baby Blacks and Cavaliers. The first test was won pretty simply by New Zealand, along with 6 following games against regional French teams. But the second game, known as the Battle of Nantes, was different. The All Blacks were beaten in brutal fashion by a French team so fired up as to arouse suspicions that there was more than sugar in their pre-match coffee, said McConnell and Johnson. Buck Shelford, number 8, and would later become captain, said, "I reckon they were drugged up to their eyeballs in that game. It's come out recently that they were. A doctor wrote about it. But I remember looking at them in the tunnel. You look your opponent in the eye, and I could tell something was up. I mean, normally you can see they're pretty focused, but I looked at these guys and their eyes were all red." And another player, Murray Pearce, who was also a policeman, said, "They came out and the French props had blood running down their foreheads, where we found out afterwards they had been headbutting the wall of the changing room." The Battle of Nantes will go down in infamy for the injury suffered to Shelford. He was knocked out cold in about the 20th minute and wasn't substituted for another 40 minutes. In between that time, at the bottom of a ruck, a French boot stomped down on his scrotum. He played on and suffered another kick, this time to the face, losing 4 teeth. When all was said and done, players all over the field were super banged up. Bleeding heads, cuts around their eyes. There was punching, kicking, and stomping galore. After the game, as Shelford was getting changed, he looked down to see a testicle hanging loose between his knees. The kick to the groin had scraped a hole open. The team doctor had to use 16 stitches to fix it all back up. John Kirwan, who played as a winger and later became a coach and author, said, "On that tour, I think Fitzy, Sean Fitzpatrick, got 186 stitches in the head. In the end, I was stitching him. The doctor had had enough." Incidentally, the Battle of Nantes was the only test match Buck Shelford ever lost. Many of the players later reflected that the loss was a blessing in disguise and set them well up for the following year. So now we get to 1987 and the year of the World Cup. I hope you can kind of see the All Blacks dominated early 1905, 1920s, and kind of were up and down from then. Kind of dived down lower and lower in the 70s, even further lower in the early 80s with the Springbok Tour of 81 and the whole controversy around 86. But now we get to 87. In the lead up to the 87 World Cup, head coach Brian Lochore selected his 2 assistants, and he selected John Hart and Alex Wiley. Hart was the head coach of Auckland and Wiley the head coach of Canterbury. Those 2 and their teams had been going at it at the top of the New Zealand provincial game for years, but now joined forces behind Lochore in search of a common goal. So their first task was adapting to the changing international rugby tactics. They needed to innovate away from the status quo of smashing teams into submission that most All Blacks teams up to then had done, and concentrate more on a fast-flowing speed and fitness, influence game. In order to ensure the fitness of their players, the coaches enlist the services of Jim Blair, a revolutionary Scottish fitness coach, who gave each player an individualized plan tailored to their position, incorporating a lot of high-intensity sprints. In early May, the team gathered and Lochore began to finalize the preparations. He overlooked David Kirk, who captained that Baby Blacks team, in favor of Andy Dalton, the captain of the Cavaliers. As fate would have it, Dalton suffered a torn hamstring before the first game, and by the time he's fit enough to return in the latter stages of the tournament, The coaches feel like they cannot replace the superb Sean Fitzpatrick. So the captain, Dalton, doesn't actually play a single minute, but is one of the most important members of the squad, which we will dive into later in the analysis. So Kirk ends up captaining the team throughout the tournament. Today, the Rugby World Cup is the most important tournament in international rugby, comparable to any sort of major international sporting cup. However, back then, it began with kind of a limp at Eden Park in Auckland, New Zealand, with about a half-full stadium and little international media interest. The All Blacks weren't favourites after losing the Bledisloe Cup the previous year, and the Bledisloe Cup is an annual tournament between New Zealand and Australia. It's just a test series. The Australians were the favourites, and the French were ahead of the All Blacks in some people's opinions too after the Battle of Nantes. So John Kirwan said, Brian Lochore summed up our attitude to the World Cup. He said, "We are world champions. We've got 100 years of history to back that, and we don't need a World Cup to say we are world champions. But if we lose the first one, then we've ruined 100 years of tradition. We don't care who we played. I think in 1987 it was really important for New Zealand that we confirmed we were the world's best rugby team, because we were that without a World Cup." Another sub-theme that heaped more pressure on the players was the subconscious need to heal the divide caused by the 81 tour and the riots, and then the Cavaliers tour of 86. Some players felt the burden of healing the fracture. In Inside the Cup, author Phil Gifford writes about Lochore. Privately, he's been horrified to see in Auckland how some of his players choose to change out of all black gear when they leave the sanctuary at the team hotel. The wounds of 81, he sees, had been opened again by the Cavaliers tour. The players were afraid of being abused or accosted, which is what the All Blacks had suffered through the early 80s. People would come and stand right in front of you and abuse the hell out of you. So New Zealand were drawn in a group with Italy, Fiji, and Argentina, and they easily swept aside all three by scores of 70-6 against Italy, 74-13 Fiji, and 46-15 against Argentina. Next up was Scotland in the quarterfinal, and this was expected to be a much tougher test. Scotland had actually tied France 20-20 in the group stage and were expected to dominate the scrum and forward line. One of their forwards was nearly 13 kgs or 30 pounds heavier than any All Black. Wiley, the assistant coach from Canterbury, would have nothing of the sort. In the week leading up to the game, he was relentless. According to Gary Wetton, one of the locks on the team, they practiced hundreds of scrums. Buck Shelford said, "We went to training in Christchurch and Grizz took the forwards, and we were on that scrum machine for an hour and a half. Then it was on the bags. Every time someone dropped the ball, we'd have to go back and start again. He really flogged us." Heaping more pressure on the game was the point that this was the first ever knockout game that the All Blacks had played. John Kirwan said, "BJ Lochore came into the changing room. It was sudden death, and we'd never had sudden death. He had 2 lots of tickets in his hands, and he said, 'Lose on Saturday, here's your tickets home.' And in this hand had tickets to Brisbane for the semi-final. 100 years of tradition, and threw them both in the air." New Zealand handled the pressure well, dominated the Scotland forwards, and the running game of their backs was too much for the Scots to deal with. They ran out winners at 30-3. Later that week, the All Blacks watched as the pre-tournament favourites Australia were beaten in one of the best World Cup games of all time by France 30-24. Grant Fox, who plays the number 10 or first 5/8 and is now a selector for the All Blacks, said, "We didn't think about it until after the event, but I'm sure that was France's final. They expended a lot of emotional energy to get up that day." So the day after that win, the All Blacks faced off against Wales in Brisbane. There wasn't as much pressure on them this game compared to the Scotland game, and they were probably buoyed and helped by what they considered was a favourable result the day before. And then the game went pretty smoothly, except for one incident involving Buck Shelford. Welsh lock Richards was punching Gary Wetton in retaliation for being elbowed in the head when Shelford stepped in and knocked him out. The referee and his assistants didn't see the whole ordeal, only Richards' punches, so the ref woke him up, and he became the first player to be sent off at the World Cup. Shelford escaped without even a warning. Although apparently the referee did come up to Shelford later and said, "You're lucky I didn't see you hit him, or you'd have gone as well." All Blacks cruised to a 49-6 win, setting up again to avenge the Battle of Nantes from the previous year. On the 20th of June, France and All Blacks met back where the tournament began less than a month earlier, Eden Park in Auckland. As with any team, players' reactions were mixed in the lead up to the game. Some were confident that France weren't going to be able to get up for the game given their enormous effort against the Australians a week prior. Some were nervous given the magnitude of the game. Regardless, the team prepared extremely well. Grant Fox. The week leading up to the final was intense, focused, accurate, and actually very quiet. It was as if everyone understood what their job was. The captain's run was at a local high school, King's College, and we trained short and sharp. There wasn't a ball dropped. Not much was said. On the way to the stadium, the crowd was incredible. Remember, like the previous episode where soccer, football was the national game of the Brazilians, rugby was the national game of New Zealand. It still is. Gary Wetton, 6'6" lock, said the country had come alive. It was amazing. The drive to the game, the people, the horns, the crowd, it was fantastic. The only time we had that before was in 1981 with planes, helicopters, containers and barbed wire. The game started well for the All Blacks. Michael Jones, who was playing as a flanker and playing in his 6th ever game for the team, scored after Grant Fox's second dropkick attempt was partially blocked. However, it wasn't smooth. Pressure began to mount, and the French began to dominate. The score was 9-0 at halftime. At halftime, Kirk said, "Work, work, work. That's what we have to do in the second half. If we work and do the basics, we're going to be world champions." Until halfway through the second half, the game was truly up for grabs, and it was grabbed by Captain Kirk. When he crossed for the try, he thumped the ground. Later, he would say, "I honestly felt we'd won the World Cup when I scored my try, and that's why I thumped the ground with my fist." From there, they willed their way to victory, doing what every incredible team does when they sense victory, never letting up and continuing to turn the screw. A late French consolation try couldn't spoil the party, and the final score was a comfortable 29-9 win. In the aftermath with the celebrations, Captain Kirk invited Andy Dalton to join him in lifting the cup to the fans who had rushed onto the field. The raising of the cup by the two captains served as a symbol of the divide that the 1981 tour that the Cavaliers re-ripped open was finally being healed. In the aftermath of the tournament, the French players were sent by the French government for a holiday in the Caribbean, and a wealthy sponsor gave every player a $20,000 watch. The All Blacks, on the other hand, returned back to their jobs. Gifford writes, "Less than 48 hours after the final, Craig Green is shivering in a bitter Christchurch southerly as he hammers nails into a roof in Linwood. Back to his job as a carpenter. Joe Stanley is at the wheel of his concrete truck in West Auckland. Andy Earle is leg roping cows in the family farm's cowshed in Rotherham in North Canterbury. AJ Wetton zips around Auckland in his courier truck delivering parcels." Just over a month after winning that World Cup, the All Blacks played another test against the pre-tournament favourites Australia. Both sides of the Tasman Sea held the opinion that if the All Blacks didn't win, they weren't the rightful winners of the World Cup. Multiple All Blacks echoed what Murray Pearce said. "We knew if we had lost that game, they would have been crowing that they should have been world champions, so there was no way we were going to lose." They go on to win, and I'm not going to go into too much more depth on the following few years, but here are some stats. 1988, they played 5 tests, winning 4, drawing 1. 1989, 7 tests, winning all 7. 1990, 7 tests, win 6, lose 1. So total 19 tests, lost 1, draw 1, won 17. And that one loss in 1990 did not bode well for the World Cup the following year. Complacency had started to slip into the All Blacks game, and those stalwarts that had carried the side through 85, 86, and 87 were declining. The team as a whole was in transition. Ian Jones, who is a lock who debuted in 1990 and is now a commentator, said, "You talk to the Australians, and that one win for them, that one loss for the All Blacks was the trigger. it made them feel that they were good enough to beat us. I don't think their belief was there before that. So that win gave Australia belief, and they would go on to beat the All Blacks in the following year in the 91 tournament in the semi-finals. But I want to cover teams, at least to begin with, at the height of their powers. Eventually, I might add in more of an analysis around their decline, but that is why this episode is on the team from 87 to 90, not to 1991. That year, they played 10 tests, winning 8 and losing 2, which is still a great record, but not touching the heights of the previous couple years. And so ends the story of the All Blacks from 87 to 1990, and it's time to turn to analysis. So to begin, the overarching goal, as I mentioned last episode, is what strategies give this team an outsized competitive advantage against its peers. Put more simply, what made it better than the rest? So there's 7 categories, and once again, these are kind of going to morph and change. But right now, coach, specialist, the squad/team, the player, innovation, tactics, and other. I also said last time that I expected this analysis to evolve, and it has already. I've added in a comparison section where I will compare any common threads that I see from previous episodes, and an application section where I'll offer a few thoughts as to how you could potentially apply lessons from the episode to your own team. So, first section, coach. Brian Lochore was a terrific coach. All the players that played under him spoke extremely highly, and he managed to bring together 2 assistant coaches who were essentially rivals. One story is perhaps illustrative of his ability to bring the team together. So, when he recognized during the tournament that the New Zealand public, especially in the cities, was still largely split in their support for the All Blacks, he decided to take the players for a trip in order to prove to them just how supported they really were. And he took his players to his home region of the Wairarapa, which actually also happens to be where I am from too, so that's kind of cool. And he assigned them in pairs to stay at various farms around the region. After this visit, the players knew that they had the backing of rural New Zealand. Warwick Taylor, who played as second 5/8 or number 12 in that team, said, "It was a real good grounding, reality, and it rammed it home that these were the people we were playing for, real New Zealanders. It was a real connection, and I don't know anyone else who would have thought of doing that other than Brian." Lochore was later to be knighted and become Sir Brian. He also had that fleeting trait known in Te Reo Māori, the native language of the Māori people, mana. And this trait is best translated in English as prestige, authority, control, power, influence, status, spiritual power, or charisma, or aura. And the intertwining of the Māori culture into the DNA of the All Blacks, which of course started way back in that native tour I talked about way at the start of the episode, means whoever leads the group needs to have a lot of mana. Sir Brian had that. Gary Wetton said BJ was the figurehead. He was a great motivator, he has a great aura about him and is still a fantastic guy. He could see players and pick players, and he had these 2 guys, Hart and Wiley, who could see differences and subtleties and suggestions, so they worked very well as a team. So Colin Meads, who played as a lock, but not during this time, and is actually considered one of rugby's greatest ever players, says, "Bloody BJ. I can say something and people will go, that's so-and-so Meads, I never liked him. Then BJ will say exactly the same thing and they'll all say, gee, Brian Lochore's a lovely man." Lochore's combination of mana, charisma, and people skills makes him a born leader. So that's the coach. I think you'll probably agree that that is probably one of the, more defining factors that led to the success of this team, just given how highly the players and everyone around him spoke of Lochore. But next we'll move to next section, specialist. So Jim Blair was that Scottish fitness coach that I touched on briefly, and he was instrumental to their success. Most players and coaches put the All Blacks' superior fitness as their main reason for their dominance. Before Blair came along, everyone on the team would train the same way, and he emphasized the specific fitness requirements for each position and introduced individual plans to the players. He helped to professionalize the amateur team, And John Kirwan said, "We knew if there were bankers and people who own bars coming down to play this game, we were going to beat them up physically. We trained really hard and we're all in great shape." Warwick Taylor would say, "We were a step ahead of the rest for fitness, which made the game a whole lot easier to think about things, make decisions under pressure. Everything gelled. We were more professional. We were still amateurs, but what we did, training and so on, was really professional. That was the difference." And I think you'll agree again. Specialist from what these players are saying, Jim Blair and his fitness kind of regime was really, really instrumental into the success of this team. So that's coach and specialist, two really strong factors into the success here. Next is the squad/team. And nothing too much to note here, but the coaches, I guess, ensured that the amalgamation of the Cavalier and Baby Black squad went smoothly. Warwick Taylor said that the team got on well together, although that togetherness wasn't really a factor I picked up on continually. In fact, David Kirk, who, would go on to captain the 87 team, said the day after the Battle of Nantes that he actually had quite a lot of trouble with some of the team due to his decision not to join the Cavaliers tour. He actually was found sobbing in his room and considered quitting. But given that he did go on to captain, I assume that those differences were kind of sorted out and the team came together. Also, that trip to the Whited Upper definitely helped the team come together too. So next section is the player. I'm going to concentrate briefly now on the captain/leaders of this group, who were definitely instrumental to the success. And I do realize I haven't actually explained Sam Walker's The Captain Class book that influenced me to start this whole podcast. But the premise behind his argument is that the best ever teams share one common trait, a captain with very specific values and traits. And for this team, he identified Buck Shelford as that man. But the All Blacks also had Kirk and Andy Dalton. And I think Dalton was perhaps one of the keys to this All Black success, even though he didn't set foot on the field. The professionalism, humility, way he carried himself without playing set an elite example for the All Blacks as players. Lochore would say Andy was the complete captain except for the 80 minutes they were on the field. David took over the minute they ran out, and Andy took over the minute they came back. Shelford, who would go on to captain, was also a terrific leader. And Sam Walker writes, "On the field, Shelford's focus never weakened. When he wasn't exhorting teammates in the dressing room to play harder, he was driving them to the point of collapse on the field. During a 1989 Test match against France, New Zealand's Murray Pearce got a nasty cut on his cheek that clearly required stitches. As he walked toward the bench, the broadcast audio picked up Shelford's voice calling from behind, ordering Pearce back to the field. 'No medical attention for these men,' the commentator said. 'You'll take the pain when you're with the All Blacks.' Asked after the match about Pearce and other injured teammates, Shelford said, 'I think they'll survive through the night.'" That kind of gives you an insight into his character and the drive he brought and the relentlessness that he brought to the team. A couple of other players I want to briefly touch on. They were technically superstars, I guess, bordering on superstars, and that was John Kirwan, who played as that winger, and Michael Jones at flanker. And Jim Blair actually said on Michael Jones, "He's as fast as all but two of the wings in the whole squad. His skill tests with the ball are as good as the inside backs. He can jump to a higher mark on a wall than the locks. His upper body strength is as good as the props. In other words, he has the physical ability to play in any position in an All Black side." And Kirwan would go on to become sort of the prototype that wingers in that forthcoming professional era in 1995 measured themselves against. And he was bigger and heavier than any winger really before him, and he stood at 6'4", 205 pounds, and he was really a dominant specimen. Next section, innovation. I guess the concentration on professionalism and fitness, and also their innovative tactics was kind of examples of innovation. I'm not going to really touch on any of that, except I'll obviously talk about tactics, which is the next section. I did touch on it briefly before, where Lochore, Hart, and Wiley know that they needed to adapt to the changing international game before the tournament. Instead of relying on their forwards to bash the opposition into submission that All Blacks teams before this had done, they want to evolve into a more free-flowing style. And one aspect of this was the increased emphasis on fitness and speed, led by Blair, but another was also the shift in the basic game style. David Kirk said it was based on continuity, and this was really the first time the All Blacks started to develop that. We had wings who would run when we moved the ball, double miss passes, fullbacks in the line at all times, sometimes going to the fullback, sometimes missing him out. Wings would stretch the opposition, they were big and stood in tackles and looked for passes inside. Think of the number of times of John Kirwan giving it to Alan Wetton. It was always about continuity and getting the ball away in the tackle. That last line is kind of especially telling. Instead of falling, protecting the ball in the tackle, like pretty much they'd been taught growing up, the players were expected to try at least to offload the ball, or if they were tackled, went to the ground and recycle it as quickly as possible in order to not let the opposition rest. And with their superior fitness, they did bash the opposition into submission, but that was by running for the full 80 minutes and recycling the ball quickly, not necessarily through an emphasis on forward play. So now we move to the other section. And the one other factor I want to address is the haka. And briefly, for those who don't know, the haka is a traditional Māori war dance that the All Blacks team performs on the field before each game. Other sports in New Zealand, and indeed other nations in the Pacific like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Cook Islands, also perform their own version of the haka, but All Blacks are masters, in my opinion. If you haven't seen it performed before, you should definitely go take a look on YouTube. So the author of the book The Jersey, The Secrets Behind the World's Most Successful Teams, Peter Bills, says, "It is an electrifying spectacle. Eyes bulge, biceps are bashed, tongues dart and tease, lips pout, faces contort, neck muscles throb, legs driven by bulging thighs stamp on the turf, as if to denote the team's defense of its territory. Hands quiver, fingers point or are drawn across throats. It is one of the great defining images of this land, a visual expression of nationhood. Most all people, fans, opposition, and All Blacks players know that the haka gives the team an almost tangible advantage before a match even begins. Sean Fitzpatrick admits it's a big advantage. Done properly, it can be very motivating. And an Australian player in the 40s and 50s said the haka gives the All Blacks a physical, mental supremacy. In Walker's book, he says, in 1884, when the All Blacks visited Australia, Sydney newspaper reported that the sound given in good time and union by 18 pairs of powerful lungs was sometimes tremendous, and it scared the Aussie players out of their wits. In the early 80s, the haka had fallen into decline. A series of Pākehā captains, persons of New Zealand European descent, which I'm one of, had considered the haka a gimmick or a formality before games, not really assigning it the correct respect or honour it deserved. Until Buck Shelford, that is. He is part Māori. In 1987, he began the task of teaching the players the correct words, actions and timing, and succeed in resurrecting a spluttering tradition into something fiercely patriotic. Sam Walker writes, Shelford's reinvigorated haka clearly became a source of energy for the team and a problem for its opponents. Some rival teams became so anxious about its effects that they called meetings to discuss how to respond to it. Now, I can't suggest that the haka is the sole or even a major reason for the All Blacks' dominance during this period, but it clearly invoked fear in the opponent. There was also another aspect to it. It helped to amalgamate the three ethnic groups that made up the All Blacks, the groups of the Māori, Pākehā, and Pacific Islander, and, join them together in their specific goal of winning. So that concludes the analysis section, and now we're going to move to the comparison piece. I expect that the more episodes, the better that this will be, but given the only team to compare is the Brazilian team, I'm not going to try and force a comparison. However, there is one interesting similarity that I kind of felt popped up, and this was the focus on professionalism when others were still essentially amateurs. Now, this wasn't technically true with international football at the time being professional, but as we kind of covered in the last episode, amateur tendencies definitely abounded. The All Blacks in 87 and 90 were truly in an amateur period, by law, but both teams placed an emphasis on going above and beyond in terms of fitness and tactical flexibility, and this led to outsized returns, I believe. All right, that's the new comparison piece, and next is going to be the new application piece. So this section is all about how can I apply the lessons learned today to my own team. And I do want to keep this reasonably broad, given the target audience isn't just for sports leaders or captains or coaches, but really leaders of any team. And I do also want to make it clear I'm no expert when it comes to team building, high-level leadership, but in-depth research of a successful team does offer some interesting insights, I believe. So one hypothesis or thought experiment would be, how do I mold the leaders on my team to display the traits that I value? Kirk, Dalton, and Shelford were all captains on this team who displayed admirable traits that matched what was of importance to Lochore. I think it's essential to very clearly communicate one's values with the team as a leader, and then drill those further into the leaders in the team, the captains, for instance, in this example, with examples of the actions that would display those traits. For instance, Kirk's ability to lead the men on the field, Dalton's humility and leadership off the field, and Shelford's abandon for his own body initiative around the haka. Having capable deputies in the shape of captains in this instance was essential for Lochore and is essential in any high-performing team. Oh, a couple of other new things I guess I'm adding in. Favorite stat that I found and favorite quote. And the stat is the winningness of the team throughout this period. So they played a total of 59 games from 87 to 90, winning 55, drawing 1, and losing 3. That's a 93.2% winning rate. And they played a total of 26 test matches, winning 24, drawing 1, and losing 1, at 92.3% win rate. So very, very dominant numbers. And my favorite quote that I found was from Polinsky in his Rugby and New Zealand history book. All Blacks are expected to win. It's part of their implicit charter with the people of New Zealand. So, thanks for listening to this episode of Incredible Teams. I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Please comment or message me on whatever platform, and subscribe if you like what you heard, and help me pick out who to cover next. I currently do not have anyone in mind, so I need some help, and see you on the next episode. Thank you.